And I will now introduce Colonel Batts from the Equal Opportunity Office.
Thank you. Just going to read the press release that Department of, or the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute puts out for each observance. So this year, the Department of Defense Observance of Days of Remembrance it proudly announces the availability of the original artwork available to download at the DOME website. Just Google DOME, it'll come up and it'll give you the different art pieces, and it'll also give you all the monthly observances that we have. So this year's observance is aptly titled "Behind Every Name, a Story, the Courageous." This year's posters honor the courageous rescuer Adolf Kamensky, an Argentine-born member of the French resistance. Kamensky masterfully forged identification papers, passports, food ration cards, and other documents to save nearly 10,000 Jews, many of them children. He risked his life and health, losing his sight in one eye and became one of the greatest rescuers of World War II. Congress established Days of Remembrance as a national annual commemoration of the Holocaust, during which we remember the 6 million Jews who were murdered. The Holocaust was a state-sponsored systematic purge of European Jews by Nazi Germany, and it collaborated between 1933 and 1945. Jews were primarily victims, as well as gypsies. People mentally and physically disabled. Poles were also targeted for destruction for their race and their ethnicity, national reason. Millions more, including homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents, also suffered grave oppression in the death under the Nazi government. As we remember those murdered, honor the survivors, pay tribute to the rescuers, and contribute to the liberators during the Days of Remembrance. We're reminded why it is imperative to confront anti-Semitism and other forms of hate-based conduct, and we are inspired to build a better future for all. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me, first of all, especially Sergeant Walter and Carol, of course, who has been great. She was really instrumental in the recent book in particular. So I couldn't have done it without her. So I want to thank you for all of your help and just the wonderful resources that are available here. Most of it I did kind of virtually, and luckily for me that I didn't have to keep driving here. But this is the first time I've actually been here, and it's really great. So I think I'm gonna make it a point to come back when make my husband come. So it's not too bad of a drive for me from South Jersey. But when I was kind of thinking about this presentation, I teach in the minor of Holocaust Studies at Stockton, and we've got a pretty good program, I'd say. We have a master's degree too, but there are really so many things. I teach so many different classes, and there are so many possibilities, I feel like, and when you've only got one lecture, it's kind of daunting because I'm always thinking, well, what's the big point? What are those major things that I can really kind of instill and bring up? So I hope that I did a good job, at least, in talking about really genocide prevention and what those lessons of the Holocaust hopefully taught us, or at least continue to attempt to teach us, right? So the idea of how do we take what we know about the Holocaust and try to apply it to other instances of genocide or human rights violations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what scholars have said about recognizing these signs and these red flags and hopefully stopping them at any of these points on that continuum. But I want to bring up one of the more prominent survivors. He's no longer with us, sadly, but Elie Wiesel, you may have been acquainted with his work. He wrote Night, and Night's often one of those books that is assigned at least a high school level, sometimes a middle school level. And not only that, but he was very adamant about education and remembrance. So in many ways, he wrote a lot of books actually. So he wrote many books about his experience and also in attempting to give speeches. So a lot of times you YouTube it, and he gives wonderful speeches on Holocaust Remembrance Day. But one of these quotes, and I'm gonna bring up a lot of quotes because I feel like it's important to kind of get the survivors' words in here. So one of these very impactful quotes by Elie Wiesel was, "There's always a moment when moral choice is made, and so we must know these good people who helped Jews during the Holocaust. We must learn from them, and in gratitude and hope, we must remember them." So that is from a book called The Courage to Care. And the editor of that book actually used to be a professor at Stockton, and she really was instrumental in making me want to teach about the Holocaust. And it was kind of funny, she was a religious sister of Mercy. She retired, but she's still teaching, and she was very adamant about me not talking in class. So back then, as an undergraduate, the idea that I would be teaching or giving presentations was just ridiculous. But she kept at it. She was really she would write on my papers. She would call on me in class. So she really instilled the importance. And for me, the first time that I actually cared about school, I didn't really have any idea about what I was doing. I just knew that, I didn't want to keep working at Burger King because that's where I was at the time as a, young person. And I just knew I should go to college, right? That's what you do. And I didn't have any idea why. So for the first time, a class actually interested me. And that was a class about the Holocaust and the moral implications. So hopefully I can kind of instill that into this presentation as well. But so we should start out with really what is genocide. The word actually didn't exist until after the Holocaust. So this man, Raphael Lemkin, he was a Polish jurist, and his idea was that the crimes that occurred during the Holocaust were really just so brutal and so beyond the scope of a word like murder that he felt like the language should change, that the event was just so drastic that it needed to actually change our way of looking at it and talking about it. So he coined this term in a 1944 book called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, and he combined these words, genos meaning a race or a tribe, and then cide meaning killing. And he actually created that word and then campaigned to the UN to have that recognized as a crime against humanity. So that was really kind of one of the first things. And I want to bring it back to some more things that Elie Wiesel said. So a little bit of background, I'm sure you've all read it. I saw recognition in the Night book, but when he tells his story, basically the book Night is about his imprisonment in Auschwitz with his father. And a lot of these things are he reacts to them in a moral way. So he's trying to, and a lot of it's a religious struggle. For him personally, he goes through a period where he was very religious. He was training to be a rabbi, so he was, before the Holocaust, that was the path he was on. And then he has this crisis of faith. So he talks about that a lot in that book. But he actually authored about 57 books that are really lesser known because they're not assigned in school usually. But he was a Nobel laureate, and he really did a lot of work in committing to education and what remembrance really means. His idea was it's not just that you remember, but it's that you use it in some way to benefit, to change. So I took an excerpt out of a 2001 speech that I feel like, again, it's really important to kind of consider how he conceptualized as a survivor, how he kind of wanted to use that to move forward. So this is a quote from him. He said, "We tell these stories because perhaps we know that not to listen, not to want to know, would lead to indifference, and indifference is never an answer. We believe naturally that one must bear witness. It wasn't easy. We knew silence is forbidden, talk impossible, but things are different today. Young people listen, and they want to know. They visit our museum, they listen to survivors, and they want to know how to prevent our past from becoming their future." And he was just a wonderful speaker, a wonderful writer. And then he echoed these sentiments in a 2003 speech, and this is a quote from him. He said, "But is remembrance enough? What does one do with the memory of agony and suffering? Memory has its own language, its own texture, its own secret melody, its own archaeology, and its own limitations. It too can be wounded, stolen, and shamed, but it's up to us to rescue it and to save it from becoming cheap, banal, and sterile. To remember means to lend an ethical dimension to all endeavors and aspirations. So Wizum believed in memory as a way to move forward and a way to educate. And he was very happy with the way that he interacted with the young people, especially because he saw, I think, hope in their interests and their empathy. So with that, we have other people. I mean, this is really the story of many people kind of trying to usher in some kind of change after the events of the Holocaust. And Raphael Lemkin was one. I mean, he really tirelessly campaigned to the UN, to the United Nations in New York, to have not only this word recognized, but to have the Genocide Convention, which I'll talk about shortly, actually made international law. And the importance of that is that there's this responsibility to act. So whoever signs on to the Genocide Convention is supposed to be a force of change, to actually act. And this is the actual text of the Genocide Convention. So when I was an undergraduate, Dr. Rittner made me memorize this, and it hasn't left. So I mean, she did a pretty good job. But basically, according to the Genocide Convention, it was 1948 when Raphael Lemkin finally was successful in at least getting this to be ratified by the UN, and then of course the individual countries then needed to sign on to it. So genocide under the terms of this is any act committed with intent to destroy, and that's an important part. So the intent is often very difficult to prove, but it's the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, and then as such, then they list things, the methods that can be used in order to qualify as genocidal acts. And as you know, since the Holocaust, there have been many things that have qualified as genocide. I'll talk a little bit about the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994, for instance. So there have been other instances that have qualified as genocide. And so a lot of things, when we're talking about genocide prevention, one of the things that we look to is Gregory Stanton's 10 stages of genocide. There were 8, and then they added 10. So what's important about this is kind of really a milestone in genocide prevention and the idea of prevention. So Gregory Stanton, a little bit about him, he was a research professor of genocide studies at George Mason University in Virginia. And he founded an organization called Genocide Watch, which is a nonprofit, so you can look it up on Google and kind of go through that. But his idea was that he came up with these warning signs, which you can see in basically every instance of genocide. And what's important, and his idea for the hopeful nature of this situation is that within each of these stages, he believed at least that there lies the ability to stop the process. So I'm going to go through each of these just briefly and talk a little bit more about that. So the first classification is, I think, pretty self-explanatory. So the idea that society is being organized, through propaganda, through things that are being disseminated by the state. There's this attempt to classify who is a citizen, for instance, who is a non-citizen. During the Third Reich, for instance, the Nazis pretty quickly stripped the German Jews of their citizenship during the Nuremberg laws. So that's an example. And kind of I like to talk about the idea of the universe of obligation. So Helen Fine was a sociologist, and she coined this term, the universe of obligation or moral obligation. And her idea was basically that there are groups of people towards whom obligations are owed in society, and rules apply, and if there's an injustice, it calls for some kind of amends. So her idea was that in saying, we all have this universe of obligation, and you can think of it as, if you throw a pebble into a pond, the ripples are coming out. So, your very close family is probably within your very close universe of moral obligation. You really care about what happens to them. And then it depends. It's very individual, how all of that kind of spreads out. Maybe your coworkers, we hope, but not always. Family, neighborhood. And then her idea was that the less you know of people, the more difficult it is to empathize. and maybe the more difficult it is for people to, call for ends to injustice when it's happening. So her idea is how. I mean, how do you what are those boundaries? How do you create more, depth within your own social circle? So during the Holocaust, what was happening was people were being placed outside of that universe of moral obligation, and through propaganda, through anti-Semitism that was already running rampant, and through the important part about it is, and like I like to tell my students very early on when we're talking about this, is that each member of this victim group that you mentioned earlier, each group was not, they were already being discriminated against in some way in society. So the Nazis did not invent the discrimination of any of those groups. They were already being marginalized for a reason. They were already being discriminated against in society. They were already minorities within a larger group. So the Nazis took these ideas and they expanded on them. They inflamed them. But those discriminations already existed. So in looking at that, the Jews were targeted, but there were also many, many other groups. So the idea that kind of recognizing in societies when these things are happening, when people are being classified, when they're being divided, right? That's a very important, and the first stage, according to Stanton, of kind of being a warning sign that something terrible might be occurring. Symbolization, of course, is, for instance, during the Holocaust, the Jewish people were given these different, like they were stamped with the letter J on their passports to, tell people, don't let them pass through these different areas. At least early on when they were allowed to even move within boundaries, within, borders. Of course, the Yellow Star by 1941, everyone over the age of 6 was required to wear that. So the symbolization, how are they actually categorizing and identifying people? And that's an example in that picture. So these first two stages are really part of the organization stage. But again, they're warning signs that if these things are happening, then others are likely to follow. And of course, discrimination. So that could take many forms, but really it's when a dominant group uses their political power, their laws or customs to deny the rights or the full citizenship of any group within that society. We saw that with the Holocaust very early on with the Nuremberg laws. Not only was the Jewish population kind of ousted from the civil service, that was one of the first things they did, but they were also ousted from public spaces. So that kind of clear division of them in society, right? Their businesses were taken over. They weren't really allowed to make any kind of connections with the non-Jewish population. So it was a really kind of slow. It was in increments. It wasn't all, as soon as Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, but that social exclusion was part of that. And any other kind of discrimination. So they were kicked out of school, for instance, kicked out of basically every profession. So something like that, that's occurring. That's a pretty clear warning sign that things are going to continue to deteriorate in a society. And by 1935, which was even before World War II officially was declared, right? So that wasn't until 39. So by 1935, the Jews of Germany were completely stripped of their citizenship. And you have to think, what kinds of things, by not being a citizen, what's now allowed to occur? Basically, the government is saying that you are kind of beyond what we're going to do anything to protect, right? And a lot of these German Jews actually had fought during World War I, so they were veterans and they were just kind of ousted from citizenship. So and then dehumanization, which I shouldn't hit the slide yet, but so a lot of times language is very important in the dehumanization process. So with, in particular in Germany, they wanted to make sure that it was something that you weren't going to look at these people as they were equals, as they were people. So they would use language often like, equating them with vermin, saying things like they were rats or bacteria, like diseases to be eradicated from society. So language in these warning stages is very, very important. The way people are categorized and described, and that dehumanization is very important. Of course, it takes different forms today because now we have social media. So it's, the ability to kind of get those messages of hate out has sadly greatly increased. But also, these things were done through print media like posters, radio, film. During the Holocaust, they were, like I said, equated with rats and diseases. And during the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994, they were referred to as cockroaches. So you see how there's an intent to deprive them of their humanity by using this kind of language. And by making it familiar, by making it, seemingly okay in society. And this kind of lays the groundwork for the acceptance of later mistreatment. And then there's a book called Faces of the Enemy, which I'd like to bring in a quote from. So Sam Keane wrote about the importance of language, and he said, "In the beginning we create the enemy. Before the weapon comes the image. We think others to death, and then we invent the battle axe or the ballistic missiles with which to actually kill them. Propaganda preceded technology." So I think that's important to keep in mind with these warning stages. And then, of course, stage 5 is organization, usually by a state, by a government, but citizens obviously form a part of this as well. But for instance, like police forces like the Gestapo during World War II. So they create this us versus them mentality, or othering sometimes it's referred to. So basically there's this clear line between one group and another group, right? And a lot of times there's fear. There's a lot of fear based behind it because people, during World War II, for instance, the Germans believed that there were limited resources, that it was like a life and death struggle, and that they were basically fighting for the existence of Germany. So then the propaganda, very important to take a look at, but the process is basically used to kind of discriminate and isolate. There's a polarization. There's this division, this clear-cut division in society. And Doris Bergen, who, if you haven't read War and Genocide, I recommend it. It's really a great book, and it's a concise introduction to the Holocaust, and I use it in a lot of my classes. But she says the following, and I think it's a really great description. She said, "People had to be prepared to accept the identification of other members of their society as enemies. In other words, a substantial part of the population had to be ready to consider it desirable, acceptable, or at least unavoidable, that certain other people would be isolated, persecuted, and killed." So it's about preparing for the eventual violence. And of course, preparation could take many different forms. It could be about ousting people, the preparation to kind of separate so that all these other things we talked about, like the social isolation, would be a way to prepare society, right? Other things that could happen where, the government is kind of just indoctrinating groups, like you have the Hitler Youth, for instance, that like young indoctrination and the League of German Maidens for the young girls. So that idea of basically creating that national community, which is what they refer to it as in Germany, is basically, and not only these groups that we talk about, but you also had to, in Nazi Germany, to be part of that national community, you also had to do things that the Nazi government wanted you to do, right? So it wasn't only that you were German, but to kind of be involved in what was going on, you also had to do exactly what the Nazis wanted you to do, right? So you couldn't, as a woman, they wanted, basically, you were to be back in the kitchen. So the idea was that you were going to kind of regress. If you were a professional woman, they didn't want you to do that. So the idea of strict rules for men and women, that was definitely something that was important in Nazi Germany, at least. So the persecution is, basically the violation of the human rights starts at this point. They're discriminating, they're ostracizing, they're maybe kind of taking measures to move populations within different areas, like the ghettoization that occurred before the concentration camps. And then they're slowly kind of displacing people, and their human rights are being violated. So that's at the persecution point of things. So a lot of, when they were walled up in these different ghettos, and it depended, they were different sizes depending on where they were, but a lot of times they weren't able to get the basic necessities. They were starving, diseases were running rampant in these areas. They didn't have clean water. So this was a first stage to the deportations. And then, of course, exterminations, the last two stages. Exterminations, the actual carrying out of the genocide, the murder of the different victim groups. And at this stage, it's pretty difficult to stop. But, I mean, so Deborah Lipstadt talks about denial. So after the genocide concludes, there's often denial on the part of usually the actors, the people that have been instrumental in creating the genocide. But, even today, which is surprising because it's the most documented genocide that we have, really, there are people that continue to deny that the Holocaust occurred. And Deborah Lipstadt has become, she's a historian, but she's actually become, for some reason, the modern kind of person to consult about Holocaust denial. And she didn't even want to. She said, at first, years and years ago, before she wrote her first book on this, she said that she really didn't take them seriously. One of her colleagues proposed that maybe you should research Holocaust denial. And she said, how ridiculous, why would I do that? Just thinking, obviously who believes that, right? A fringe group. But sadly through her research, she realized that it actually was not a fringe group. Many, many people. And the way the deniers kind of construct things makes it believable to people that don't know a lot about the history. So it's kind of a very sneaky way to kind of redefine history in a lot of cases. But so she actually got into some trouble. There's a movie called Denial about this, if you've seen it. But so Deborah Lipstadt got into some trouble because she called David Irving a Holocaust denier. He is. But he sued her for libel in the British court system. And that movie and then the book that the movie's based on is basically about how she had to fight to not be held liable for calling him a Holocaust denier. So she basically had to prove, the burden of proof was on her, because it was the British court system. So she had to basically prove, and she won. So sorry if I spoiled that. If you haven't seen the movie yet, but I feel like they would have made a movie if she lost. That would have been a horribly depressing movie. But in a TED Talk, if you can find the TED Talk that Deborah Lipstadt did, it's only about maybe 12 minutes. It's really good. But she says, and this is a quote from her TED Talk, the first time I heard about Holocaust denial, I laughed. Holocaust denial. The Holocaust, which has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world, who could believe it didn't happen, right? But sadly, there are groups and people that deny it existed and that the Holocaust happened. So again, this ties back to Elie Wiesel's idea that not only is remembrance important, but historical accuracy is important, and that there's always a chance that there could be an assault on truth. So that kind of ties things together. But really, the importance of Holocaust education continues to be the best way to prevent future genocides. So I have to plug Stockton a little bit. So one of my colleagues, this isn't something that I'm involved with, although I kind of promote it, but one of my colleagues, Mike Hayes, who's a professor at Stockton of historical studies, he has embarked on this Holocaust Survivors of South Jersey project in an effort to do these things like aid remembrance. And the students were he has a lot of student helpers, so it's just really a great project all around. But if you have time and you want to look that up on your own, it's actually mapped out the different survivors. So I think that's pretty cool. And then you can go and click and it'll populate actually who they were and things about what if they had a business perhaps where they were and family members and things like that. So that's pretty cool. So you can go and explore that if you want. Thing. And then you can actually click on the survivor profiles, and they have over 1,000. He said, I thought it was only going to be a couple hundred, maybe. They currently, I think, have over 1,000. So this is not even anywhere close to the people that are going to be on here. But you can actually click on any of these, and they're basically survivors and survivor families that have settled in the South Jersey area. And what's really interesting is not only the survival aspect, but how they actually impacted the local area and local history. I mean, they had businesses and families, and just it's really inspiring to me that you can kind of trace these families that continued on and really had a lasting effect on New Jersey and still continue to have an effect on New Jersey. So if you're interested, I encourage you to take a look at that. That's just one of the things that are going on there. But I want to close out with Elie Wiesel again. So hope for the future. Hopefully there is hope. But he said, is there hope? Is there hope in memory? There must be. Without hope, memory would be morbid and sterile. Without memory, hope would be empty of meaning, and above all, empty of gratitude. So with that, I hope that I've given you at least a good overview and some things to consider, because I feel like mostly it's about kind of expanding that universe of moral obligations, about education and empathy, and kind of taking these lessons and hopefully applying them and making connections to today, really. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but that's it for the presentation. So
With the 10 categories being defined, is there any proof of at what stage you could really stop something? Or, for example, the Rwanda, was Rwanda not such a genocide because we knew about the Holocaust? Like, do we learn from the history and not, obviously we know it goes on, unfortunately it still goes on, but do we shorten that lifespan of genocide, or can we?
I think definitely the awareness is there in many cases, but Rwanda, sadly, it still didn't prevent things. I think also, so the way that things were unfolding, there were people, Rwandans, that were saying to the international community, they were attempting to tell the UN, we know that they're planning to kill us. And the Tutsis were saying, and the Hutu majority, this language is in existence. They are making lists, these things that, not that they were necessarily saying like the Holocaust in these 10 stages, but they were aware that the language and the preparation was there. But sadly, they did send the UN presence was there, but they had a mandate of inaction. So they made safe areas and people went to these safe areas, but they were not instructed to engage. So they basically watched the genocide unfold in front of them. So the only thing that stopped that genocide was actually a counter. The Rwandan Patriotic Front came in and countered that. So the UN, one hopes that eventually these warning signs, like early on, like I said, the earliest stage is when you can really prevent it. Because once the mechanisms, once the actual like physical destruction begins, it's very difficult. But the UN and the international community is supposed to, like that convention is supposed to be the document that says you need to go in. But sadly, it hasn't really occurred.
Do you need?
Exactly, because then they get stuck on intent. Was their intent? Is it a genocide, right? It's difficult to prove intent, things like that. So it gets bogged down in that bureaucracy, and then we still don't act in time, right? So Rwanda happened very quickly. Rwanda, within 3 months, about 800,000 to 1 million people were killed in that one of the smallest countries in Africa. And, it was largely without guns. Like they had some guns, but largely it was very hand-in-hand. It was machete. So then the UN went and there were Dutch peacekeepers that got killed, and they didn't have a mandate to act. So they just watched it happen. And that has occurred in areas like Darfur, and there's still genocide that happened despite us knowing this. So I think a lot of times it's that political will that needs to happen, but people need to make it an issue, So sadly, exactly. I hope that answered the question. Okay. Yes.
I got a question. I've never heard of Holocaust denial. Never heard of that. I didn't even know that was a thing. But when given free speech in America, does that even become hate speech at any point, or is it?
And that's also something that's difficult to prove because we do have freedom of speech. But then, if you can prove that it is somehow inciting some type of violence, then yes, but it's difficult to prove. So really, that's where, I mean, and social media platforms can shut it down. Sometimes they do, but they have been lax in catching it and shutting it down. Sometimes it gets flagged for misinformation, but often it doesn't. So yeah, I mean, it's usually only made an issue when it can be linked to some kind of violence that occurs. Yeah.
Which means by then you're kind of already done your product categories,
Right.
you know.
And a lot of it is, you can't reason with a lot of it because it's very kind of ahistorical, the discussion that's going on. So, I mean, my professor would say, I know what I know, don't bother me with the facts type of situation. So it becomes very difficult to kind of combat that because, how much more evidence do you need? But there is a resurgence, especially there's a concern that as the survivors pass away, that there's going to be more denial, right? Which is really why, when I talked about, I did some work with the nurses. Actually, there were Army nurses that served in evacuation hospitals and liberated some of the camps, and they gave their testimony to the Holocaust Memorial Museum as outside observers, but then going into the camps and trying to save the survivors that were there. And a lot of them cited the idea that they had heard denial, and they said, well, maybe they'll believe me, I have to add to the voices, and they gave their testimony because of that. So even Eisenhower, right when he saw these camps for the first time, he said that this is just it's so beyond the realm of what humans think that we're capable of, that he said he wants people to see it. He wanted the pictures to be taken because he didn't want people to deny it just because it was so egregious and just so horrific to witness. So even in World War II, the way Eisenhower said, we have to document this. So, yeah, Carol.
Yes, in my research to try and get genocide posts done on our museum Facebook page, I found out about in the 70s was the Cambodian genocide and the Khmer Rouge. Do you have anything about that?
Yes, I did some. Yeah, so basically that was, and again, a lot of times genocide is committed within another war, right? So World War II, World War One, you had the Armenian genocide. So it's either something that's going on, locally, like a civil war, something like that, or a larger war. So with the Cambodian genocide, that was something that was going on, and also even before that, the Cultural Revolution could be considered because the people that were targeted were intellectuals, right? So there's a very kind of specific group of people that were being targeted and kind of ousted from society. So in these cases, and there have been a lot of things like in the Sudan, since the early 2000s. So there are definitely other instances going on where you can kind of see these common connections of classification and identification. And basically that us versus them. You always have to be aware when something is going on that's very polarizing, that it's kind of an us versus them mentality. You have to be have your, paying attention to it, because that's a very dangerous way of viewing society. Right? Division is it's one of the first steps in classifying genocidal behavior. And not that everything ends up being a textbook genocide, but there could be human rights violations. I mean, other things that aren't recognized internationally as genocide are also very damaging to populations and individuals. So, any other questions?
Fiona? What about the voices that you mentioned in your previous answer? Because when I researched the Cambodian genocide, I saw that there were eyewitness survivor testimonies that you could click on, and I did try to share that. It didn't go very far out on our Facebook page, but I'll try again, or maybe if you post it as a story, more people would see it.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's a great so the Shoah Foundation, which was created after the creation of the movie Schindler's List. So Spielberg actually funded and created this resource. So first it started with the documenting the Holocaust survivors and taking their oral histories and things like that. But it's expanded to other genocides like Rwanda and Cambodia. So if you actually just go on their YouTube channel, you can watch all that stuff for free. And some of them are very long, some of them are kind of clipped, but it's a great resource on many, many different genocides.
I got another question.
Sure.
So Christianity has had a lot of started a lot of wars, right? The spread of Christianity. Would that be a form of genocide? The start of those wars to try to spread Christianity? Because I mean, they kill people.
I mean, under the convention, I think you would have to say that it's a specific, so religion for some reason is not, I mean, so it'd have to be like an ethnical, racial, so it's very restrictive, the Genocide Convention, honestly. People have advocated to extend it. And the idea is that some countries maybe don't want it extended because then things could apply to them, if that makes sense. But certainly that's, when you think about Christianity, a lot of the anti-Semitism that ended up being kind of within that, the things that the Nazis were saying, for instance, a lot of that had its basis in Christianity, in that fight, particularly when the Protestants left. Martin Luther, said a lot of very anti-Semitic things. He has a whole pamphlet that you can look up online about. It's called The Jews and Their Lies, because they didn't convert. He thought he would have like a mass conversion, and they didn't. So, I mean, religion has definitely contributed to that seed ground that I talked about, that anti-Semitism that was already there in society and already accepted. So definitely, ideologically, definitely it's a part of it.
Things looking in hindsight, 100 years, 200 years, certainly, no doubt we could call it that now, looking from a current definition. It doesn't forgive then, but understanding how this would be saying could be the spread of Islam from the Mecca and spread out. The Huns coming across from Central Asia, pretty much almost everything until it became modern nation states, probably in the late 1800s. Hey, here's our borders. We recognize, treaties and things like that came about, and that was a step forward. And now, if you're going to violate these things, we're going to call it something ideally act.
Right.
We know what
Moving
we
along
say.
their intelligence.
Right.
Yeah. And something else to consider is that you also have something that people call a cultural genocide. So, for instance, like if you look at indigenous populations here, was trying to Christianize them a deliberate destruction of their way of life, their culture.
By definition.
Right, exactly. So there's that as well. So it's the ideology behind it is very important, and not to say that it's strictly religious, but it's that interpretation that people put on it. So that interpretation has led to a lot of violence and discriminations. So great question. I hope I answered that. We're going to talk about that for you.
It's interesting that religion is, like you said, it's not mentioned in there, but I mean, if it would be mentioned, it would cause a lot of problems, right? Because it's had a lot of violence with Christians and other religions. That's the power of religion, I guess.
Yeah.
Most of the countries wouldn't have signed the treaty.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
If you're going to single out their past history.
It's interesting because, like, the group you discriminate against can be religious, but the ideology behind it, there's no mention of whether it's religious or not. You know what I mean? So that's another
Well,
thing.
this is generic.
Right.
Well, I mean,
So if you say you're going to destroy all the Catholics, for instance, then that would qualify, but not the original ideology. You know what I mean? So like the purpose behind it is not something that.
So instead of saying we're going to destroy all the Catholics, you just say we're just going to spread Catholicism, then that'd be different.
Exactly.
Nice.
Right.
Okay.
So see how it gets complicated.
Yeah.
All about the
Words
words.
Right.
Words
It's all about
matter.
how words
Exactly. Words do matter.
Oh,
They
that's
definitely matter. And like I said, I mean, the U.S. was one of the last countries to sign because of the fear that there were instances in the past that could definitely be applicable to the Genocide Convention. So there was that fear. They didn't sign it until much later. So there was kind of like countries that didn't sign were looking at their own past and saying, well, does this apply? What are we doing by signing this? What's going to happen?
But was there a clause or any type of within that document to say we're gonna look back at it, or from now on? we're
Yeah,
not-
so
you know what I mean,
They
like,
could definitely go back. Yeah.
and say, well, you did this, but
Right.
you're making it right now
Right.
by being a part of a solution.
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly. And most of this is the responsibility to act when it's occurring. right, so, but there
Yeah,
was
to
that.
get the US to have to act.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
UN forces at least, so the international forces are supposed to be committed, right? And just, right, or just kind of get, half-heartedly sent there. So. Any other questions? Thank you all for being here, I think that was interesting at least.
No, it was very.
I've got some cards back there if you wanna email me or call me or anything.
Thank you.
Think of any other questions or anything, but thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Token of thanks, our tradition.